Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin do not agree on much. But as of 2026, they both seem amenable to one particular figure who could act as lead mediator in peace negotiations: Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. Now, it may seem surprising that Zelensky would be receptive to help from someone with such long-standing ties to Putin. But even so, he welcomed Abramovich to Kyiv in May, asking him to act as a middleman to start direct bilateral talks between the two leaders. I'm Anna Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv. This week, we're going to look at Abramovich's reappearance at this juncture in the peace process, with US-led talks at a dead end, and Russia's offensives largely stalled. Will Abramovich be the peacemaker that finally brings the two sides together? Let's unpack the odds. People around the world with no particular interest in geopolitics may know Abramovich as the longtime former owner of the soccer team Chelsea FC. He was one of the most prominent of a generation of Russian oligarchs that moved to London after the fall of the Soviet Union and entrenched their assets there, earning the city the nickname Londongrad. His acquisition of Chelsea in 2003 made him a household name, but he'd been leading an eventful life long before he emigrated to the UK. Born in 1966 in the central Russian city of Saratov and orphaned as a toddler, Roman Abramovich left school at 16 to begin working, first as a mechanic, then as a Soviet soldier, and then beginning his lifelong journey as an entrepreneur. From selling toys to selling oil companies, Abramovich has been involved in countless ventures. He also spent some time in politics, serving 8 years as governor of Russia's far eastern Chukotka region, where he reportedly invested billions of dollars of his own money into local infrastructure. There have also been some well-documented instances of corruption, including an enrichment scheme in the 90s that allowed him to buy an oil company for $250 million and sell it to the government for $13 billion a decade later. But still, he avoids a reputation as a shady dealer. Many agree that his rise from rags to riches can be attributed to his ability to navigate relationships, to strike balance between his powerful interests and allies, with bonds that last through regime changes, sanctions, and more. Abramovich was reportedly a friend and backer of the first president of independent Russia, Boris Yeltsin, even living in the Kremlin for some time in the mid-90s at Yeltsin's behest. He was also reported to be involved in the selection of Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin. Abramovich himself denies that he and Putin are close, or that he holds influence in the president's administration, but onlookers have noted that Abramovich has always enjoyed a placid relationship with the Kremlin. He's largely avoided public criticism or condemnation of Putin and his policies. He's been accused by human rights groups, including that of now-deceased Russian oppositionist Alexei Navalny, of having long-standing ties to the Kremlin, and he's among the wealthy Russians sanctioned by Europe and the US after 2022. But he hasn't really suffered greatly for it. Not enough for him to publicly distance himself from his native country. Even though he's anchored himself in London, Abramovich is certainly not considered to be exiled, and remains popular both outside and inside Russia. Putin seems to trust and respect Abramovich without demanding overt loyalty or isolation from the West from him, which is no small feat and a balance that not many oligarchs have managed to maintain. But you could look at it another way. Maybe Putin sees Abramovich as more useful to him on the outside than the inside. And although Abramovich's name has been in heavier circulation recently in relation to peace talks, it's important to note that his involvement dates back to the very first day of the full-scale invasion. Or actually, the second day. But we'll get into that after a quick break. We're coming into the final stretch of our largest community effort to date, and there's still a small amount of time for you to be part of it. If you become a member of the Kyiv Independent community today, you'll be helping us to set a historic record, while also getting some cool membership perks in return, including the chance to have your questions featured on this show every week. Our work is funded by viewers like you, and we still have lots of it to do, so your support is more valuable now than ever. And to find out more, visit the link in the description below. Abramovich entered the peace process in the early days of the full-scale invasion. and not at Russia's request, but Ukraine's, with Ukrainian officials asking Abramovich to act as a mediator. Zelensky even reportedly asked then U.S. President Joe Biden to hold off sanctions against Abramovich early into the full-scale war, an investigation by the Financial Times found. And as you know from the other episodes, the 2022 bilateral talks were short-lived. No consensus was reached, and delegations from the two countries wouldn't meet again directly for several years, as the war continued. Abramovich fell out of headlines during those intervening years, but he was involved in several rare acts of cooperation between the warring countries, including the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the release of foreign POWs captured by Russia. And the most notable of these prisoner releases was Aden Aslin, a British volunteer fighter who was taken prisoner while defending Mariupol in April of 2022. Abramovich was central in negotiating his release later that year. So although we're seeing Abramovich's name more frequently mentioned in 2026, he's actually been involved in the peace process for quite some time. But that begs the question. If he's been involved behind the scenes all along, why did his trip to Kyiv make headlines now in 2026? Why is Zelensky signaling public willingness to negotiate with him now? Well, according to Zelensky himself, Abramovich came to Kyiv to ascertain Ukraine's key demands, as Zelensky said in this interview with Sky News.
He came and he wanted to give him the message that they are ready that they want to understand what we are ready to do. I said, the question is not about us. You are fighting against us on our territory. And I said to him about Donbass, it was the key message. And I said, no, we will not live.
Zelensky also said after that he'd spoken with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer about repurposing the funds from the sale of Chelsea FC to strengthen Ukrainian air defense, although that's highly unlikely in reality. The news of Abramovich's May trip to Kyiv was broken in early June, just a few days after Zelensky penned an open letter to Putin imploring him to engage in talks to end the war promptly. Russia rejected the letter's contents from the outset, and on June 5th, Putin made a veiled reference to a colleague, assumed to be Abramovich, claiming that said colleague had visited Kyiv in an unofficial capacity, and that after speaking with him, Putin saw no new reasons to meet with Zelensky. In preparation for this episode, I spoke with Mark Hollingsworth, author of the book Londongrad, From Russia with Cash, The Inside Story of the Oligarchs. He confirmed the descriptions of Abramovich as an emotionally intelligent negotiator, capable of maintaining neutrality and treading thin lines between warring factions. But Hollingsworth also emphasized two important points. Firstly, that Zelensky is privy to information about Abramovich that the public is not, and we have to put some degree of trust in that. Secondly, that information about the peace process is released strategically. The takeaway from recent news is not that Abramovich is suddenly involved, but rather that Zelensky has deemed it in Ukraine's best interest to now signal willingness to work via Abramovich. And that says more about Ukraine's position than it does about Abramovich as an individual. Because we can dissect him as a person all we want, his history, his attitudes, his aptitudes. But when we zoom out, we see that he's reappearing in headlines at a time when things are going quite badly for Russia on the battlefield, and Ukraine is gaining leverage that it previously didn't have. So could Abramovich's involvement be a sign that Moscow feels backed into a corner, and Kyiv sees it as a way to press its advantage? Well, some think so. Before we go on, it's important to make one thing clear. Moscow and Kyiv's shared willingness to negotiate via Abramovich indicates a level of cooperativity that seems like progress towards peace. However, neither side has wavered on their key demands, which remain as irreconcilable as ever. Zelensky reportedly told Abramovich that Ukraine will never cede Donbass, which has been Russia's main objective in the war since its failure to take Kyiv. And as evidenced by Putin's dismissiveness over his colleague's visit to Kyiv, a leader-to-leader meeting in the near future remains unlikely. Just because they can agree on a broker does not mean the two sides are ready to compromise. Experts warn that there's a limited window of time this year in which Russia and Ukraine can directly negotiate an end to the war, because winter temperatures are likely to bring on military struggles and humanitarian crises that will change the tenor and urgency of negotiations. And as always, Ukraine needs to demonstrably show that it's willing to end the war and that Russia is the one preventing peace. And that's been a theme in various discussions of negotiations, that Ukraine must demonstrate its willingness to engage with Russia, even when compromise remains unlikely or even impossible. Russia has long tried to paint Ukraine as the instigator and maintainer of the conflict, and Ukraine has long tried to show that it wants an end to the war more than anyone, just not an end that compromises future security. So in this way, particularly given Ukraine's current advantage on the battlefield and through long-range strikes, publicly dealing with Abramovich does serve Ukraine. It shows that Zelensky is willing to communicate directly with Russian leadership via one of their own chosen citizens. Putin's refusal of Zelensky's invitation, which was delivered by a mutually accepted envoy, does indeed make him look like the one unwilling to negotiate. And this isn't the first time that this dynamic has played out, but there is a big difference between inserting a would-be mediator like Steve Witkoff, who has no real understanding of the historical context or experience in these kind of negotiations, compared to someone like Abramovich, who does know what's going on with both sides and does appear to be trusted by both leaders. We spoke with David C. Lingelbach, author of The Oligarch's Grip, Fusing Wealth and Power, about what Abramovich's involvement says about Russia's position in negotiations at this time. As we're talking about Abramovich and his role in peace negotiations, what does his reappearance from your perspective say about Russia's position in peace negotiations now? What does he as an actor say about what they're trying to convey?
Honestly, I am not convinced that this is a major development or a big signal from Putin to Zelensky. I mean, I think you have to kind of put it in the context of who Abramovich is and the position he holds in Russia today. My take on that is that he is not somebody that's in sort of the inner circle of Putin, that he is a useful person from time to time, but I don't think that he's particularly close to Putin or to the people that are close to Putin anymore. Now, was that different at one point in time? Sure. Certainly when I was working in Russia in the 1990s, Abramovich became quite close to Putin, and then in the early 2000s was really close. But my sense is that this is not somebody that Putin would use to convey a serious message to Ukraine or to Zelensky in particular.
So in that sense, would you say that his involvement is yet another way that Russia is prolonging the war and kind of not engaging?
Yeah, that was my take, at least when I initially saw this news that he was in conversations again. It's my sense, and oligarchs are very performative in many ways. I think this is another performative act by both Putin and Abramovich. I mean, I think Abramovich is trying to himself sort of improve his reputation with certain people. And by doing this, he probably sees relatively little downside risk for him personally, but also, not a whole lot of upside either. I mean, I would be shocked if this turned into some sort of a genuine peace initiative, because I just don't think he's the person who has the ear of Putin or of the people around him to kind of begin to make that happen.
And I mean, can we read into Abramovich's actions at all what his goal might be if it's maybe not to realistically broker the ultimate peace deal? Is there something that he wants to achieve out of this war, some place that he wants to be when this war is over, that this is in service of, that we can kind of glean?
Well, I guess you have to look at Abramovich's prior dealings in Ukraine. So I try to think in longer terms than the current moment. And if you look back before 2022 and into the 2010s, Abramovich had a certain experience in Ukraine, but nothing nearly as intense or knowledge producing as some of the other Russian oligarchs that could possibly be involved in this process. So, when I saw Abramovich in the back in the beginning engaging in these intermediation efforts, I kind of scratched my head and wondered, like, what does he bring to the table here exactly? What is his knowledge? I don't think he's got any particularly deep experience or knowledge about Ukraine. Therefore, you have to assume that he's primarily a tool of Russia. Um, I think it's quite interesting that the Ukrainian government is even willing to sit down and talk to him. And I suspect that's simply because, people want to have peace. I mean, and so you don't want to turn your back on any effort. But I assume that President Zelensky knows better than I do that there's real limits to what you can take from a conversation with Roman Abramovich in this setting. So, as one knows from negotiation, you got to go with what you got, and if Zelensky somehow is able to find in Abramovich's words some kind of an opening, then that's great. But I think that the chances of that happening are pretty low at this point.
Hi there, it's Chris Powers here, the Brussels correspondent from the Kyiv Independent, and I will be taking the members' question this week. So a big thank you to Jakub, who has got in touch, interested in Ukraine's journey to become a future member of the European Union, and was wondering if we could get more detailed information on this accession process, how it all works. It's true that when he looked and when I look out there for other sources, sometimes it's hard to get up-to-date information on what precisely is going on. So let's get into it. It's not brand new that Ukraine has tried to join the European Union. Of course, back as far as 2014, when the Maidan happened, this was partly about what Ukraine's future relationship with the EU should be. The country soon signed the association agreement with the EU after that, which was a commitment that the two would integrate further in the coming years. Since then, Ukraine has been doing a lot of work, a lot of reforms to stamp out corruption, to align with EU market standards, basically to bring the two sides closer together. And since Russia launched its full-scale invasion, this process has only accelerated and become more intense. Ukraine formally applied to be a candidate country just after the full-scale invasion began, and the EU accepted this candidate request in June of that year. Since then, technical work has continued, preparations have continued, and in 2025, the European Commission said that Ukraine was ready to open all 6 so-called enlargement clusters with Ukraine. Those clusters are basically the to-do lists that you have to do to be a full EU member state, aligned with all the laws and the functionings of the EU. But since 2025, further progress had been halted by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who had basically vetoed everything to do with Ukraine, including further progress on accession talks. When he was defeated in an election in April by the new Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, this position has changed. Hungary and Ukraine found an agreement over a set of issues between them about the Hungarian-speaking minority living in the far west of Ukraine. And on June 15th, Ukraine was able to open the first of these 6 so-called clusters. That cluster is called Fundamentals. It covers everything to do with the rule of law, democracy. It's a big one. It's always the first to open. It's always the last to close. And there's a lot of homework in there for Ukraine to do. But there are still a remaining 5 that need to be opened. Over here in Brussels, people expect that to take place already in July before they all break for summer holidays. But there have been a few different objections around taking this forward. Poland is afraid for its farmers, for its trucking industry, that Ukraine will outcompete, and so they're a bit reticent to go forward. Other countries, I've heard Austria, for example, are worried about double standards, where Ukraine is given special treatment and able to go faster through the process than other countries that have been waiting for a very long time. For example, in the Western Balkans, where North Macedonia applied in 2005 and is still languishing behind. So these concerns, they're political ones, but they have to be taken into consideration before things can move further forward. Once that's done, the work is really with Ukraine. It has to pass the reforms. There's a clear checklist. The Commission, European Commission, will verify that progress. There'll be an interim set of benchmarks when they're basically halfway through. And then countries will vote unanimously each time to close these different parts of the process. Once that's done, the two sides will draw up a treaty on joining the EU together. And then after that, Ukraine has to vote, I think, in a referendum to become a member. But also this has to be ratified by all 27 EU member states. And some of those too will have a referendum. For example, the Netherlands, Ireland, they love referendums there. And that might also throw a further spanner in the works. So it's going to be a long and difficult journey. My advice would be, if you want to keep up to date with this, keep reading me, keep reading the Kyiv Independent, because we are going to be paying very close attention to this.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine, although I will be on a 2-week break, and one of my lovely colleagues will be filling in. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. As always, there will be more information linked in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.